Hello everybody, welcome to this new episode of Low Code Corner. Today we are talking about null values, the difference between null values and empty strings, and how we can manage null values in DaDaBIK. I want to talk about that because I've received during the past years many support requests about this issue. So I think it's not. I think it's a topic that is not very clear. So first of all, what is the null value? We should think about an attribute of a table. The values you can use for an attribute are values that belong to a domain. For example, if a table field is an integer field, you can only store in that field integer values. You cannot store, 1.6, right? The null value is a special value, not part of the attribute domain, that is there just to represent the lack of value. You don't have a value for that attribute on that record. That's the null value. It's a standard way to say lack of value. Okay, I'll skip some technical details and forgive me if I won't be very formal, but I want to go straight to the point. So if you want to accept the null value for a specific attribute, you have to set that in your database. For a specific attribute, you have to say something like accept null values. In DaDaBIK, you can do it from here. Here we are in the context table, and here you have this nullable column. If you want to accept null value for a specific attribute, you just have to, of course, choose yes here. All right. The problem you might have, the thing that is confusing sometimes, is the difference between the null value and an empty string. So we are talking about not about numeric attributes, but about alphabetic and alphanumeric fields, such as varchar or text. So from now on, I'm going to talk specifically about MySQL. The situation can be different for other database management systems, but in most of the cases, empty strings and null values are two different things. Because an empty string is still a value, part of the domain, is a string with a string having 0 characters, while the null value is not part of the domain, lack of value. I know that you might think that this doesn't make much sense, but this is how many relational databases work, so we have to deal with it. And in particular, you should note that even if you set nullable no, you can still insert an empty string for an attribute. So let's see what happens if I use DaDaBIK with the default settings. I'm talking about the settings related to the null values, which are treat blank as null 0 and null checkbox 0. This is the default settings for DaDaBIK, like the current version of DaDaBIK, DaDaBIK 10.1. Then things might change in the future. If I use these default settings and we are talking about the contacts table and in particular for the notes contact, this attribute, we have nullable yes. Okay. So then I'm trying to add a new contact with some random value here. Okay, and I'm leaving notes empty. Okay, the record has been inserted, registered in the table. Let's look at how it looks in PHPMyAdmin. Maybe I can. All right, this is our record, and notes is empty. It's not null, it's empty. You can see null values here, for example. Okay, why it is empty? Because this attribute, it is true that this attribute can accept the null values because we said that here, right? But with the original DaDaBIK settings, if we leave a field empty, the thing we are going to insert in the database is an empty string. So what you can do to insert the null value? You can do a couple of things. You can set this null checkbox to 1, and this has a particular effect here. Let me show. You have this additional checkbox for each field that is used to set for that field the null value. So basically here, if you want to insert a null value, instead of just leaving the text area here, this text box empty, you have to check here. We can try. And we add another random customer contact. Okay. All right, as you can see, this is the new record, and as you can see, we have null here. Okay, that is different respect to the result we had before. There's another thing you can do, which is probably the best one. Instead of using null checkbox 1, you can set treat blank as null 1 to 1. With that configuration, as you can see, the null checkboxes disappear. And if you don't specify any value for a field, the content that will be registered for that field is null. Okay, so this is the setting I would recommend, and it is probably going to be the default one at some point for DaDaBIK. What else? Yeah, this can also help you avoiding problems with other kind of field types. For example, numeric field types. Let's take, for example, this country field. Country field here. This country field here is a lookup field. You have a list of countries, but the field itself is an integer field because it's ID country. It contains the ID of the country. If we look here, ID country in the table contacts is an integer field. We can also see that here in phpMyAdmin, ID country integer. Okay, so what happens if I set treat blank as null 0 and I try to insert a new contact without specifying the country? What happens? Okay, I get an error. Why? Because since I didn't specify a value for the country, and since this was 0, the value I'm asking to the DBMS to insert is the empty string. But empty string is not an allowed value for integer fields. That's why I'm getting an error. This can really depend on how your database is set. It can also happen that implicitly the DBMS converts this empty string in a value that is acceptable for that particular domain. The domain of integers in this particular case. And what can happen? It can happen that the DBMS converts your empty string to 0. Okay? But this is probably not what you want. So again, it is way better if you insert null. Okay? A similar thing can happen with other field types such as dates, for example. About your application, having in a field an empty string or the null value can, of course, make a difference. So even if you, let's say, you want to search for something, for a specific contacts, here, for the search operators, you have two different operators. You have is empty and is null, which are different. The same in SQL. So in SQL, to search for an empty string, you do something like this, equal to quote quote. To search for a null value, you do something like is null. Okay. The last thing I want to show you is in the form configurator. As you know, for each field, you can set if the field is required or not. If you set yes, the user cannot leave that field empty. Of course, if you set no, the user can leave the field empty. Then what is actually, if the user leaves the field empty, what is actually registered in the database, as we said before, depends on all the other settings. So to summarize, my general recommendations are for the settings, for the DaDaBIK settings here, null checkbox 0 and treat blank as null 0. If you think that for a specific field a user can leave the field empty, blank, you should allow the null value for that field database side. So you should make the field nullable. Okay? And in DaDaBIK, in the form configurator, you should choose no here, not required. Consider that DaDaBIK should do this last part automatically, at least if you keep the smart installation parameters as they are in the default settings. So when DaDaBIK finds a field that is not null, the field is configured, is set as required yes in the form configurator, and vice versa. Okay, that's it for this episode. If you have any question, just post a comment or write on our forum. See you next time. Ciao!